Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Wednesday seminar series hosted by the Mossavar-Rahmani Center for Iran and Persian Gulf Studies. My name is Sharmin Bijan Mossavar-Rahmani. Today, we are delighted to have Professor Kamran Talattof as our speaker. Professor Kamran Talattof holds the Ilahe Umidyar Mir Jalali Chair in Persian and Iranian Studies and is the founding director of the Roshan Graduate Interdisciplinary Program in Persian and Iranian Studies at the University of Arizona. His interdisciplinary research and teaching focus on the intersections of ideology, gender, and textuality in Iran and the broader Near East. He has published numerous articles, books, including three award-winning monographs: The Politics of Writing in Iran, A History of Modern Persian Literature, and Modernity, Sexuality, and Ideology in Iran, The Life and Legacy of a Dancer, both published by Syracuse University Press. As well, in 2022, his book, Nezami Ganjavi and Classical Persian Literature, Demystifying the Mystic, was published by Palgrave Macmillan. Professor Talattof has also published several seminal edited volumes: The Handbook of Ancient, Classical, and Late Classical Persian Literature, and the Handbook of Post-Classical and Contemporary Persian Literature, both published by Routledge Academic Press in 2024. Both are notable for their extensive coverage of subjects and authors. His lecture today, Love and Religion in Nezami's Works, Searching for Dantean Similarities, will compare the works of Nezami and Dante to illustrate how these two poets differ and how the growing comparison of Nezami's work with religious texts has impeded a fuller understanding of his worldview and poetry. Please join me in welcoming Professor Talattof.
Thank you very much, Dr. Janabzadeh. Thank you all for coming. So in my previous work on the 12th century Nezami Ganjavi, I approached his 5 volumes of poetry and Romance writings in terms of literary devices he uses, the literary techniques with which he writes. And in every chapter of the books, I compared him to one or more Persian poets, generally the greatest Persian poets of classical period. The one anomaly is in a chapter where I compared his work to the works of Italian poet Dante. However, because recently there is a volume of collected articles focusing exclusively on the comparison of Nezami and Dante from various perspectives. I have decided to revisit the subject and do further research on this comparison and lay out a proposal for my further future investigations on the topic. Now, you probably know both poets very well. Nezami is known for these 5 romances. They're collectively called Panj Ganj, or 5 Treasure, and Dante for his phenomenal Divine Comedy. Now, the collected volumes, in which, ironically, I also have an article there and arguing for incomparability of the 2 poets, compare these 2 giants of poetry in terms of several aspects, including a spiritual journey, and women, politics, myth, symbolism, and then argue for how both poets are similar in writing in this genre on these subjects, and even some of the articles that contrast them for coming to the conclusion that, well, there are some disagreement, but nevertheless, they have common interests. For example, I just give this one example, religious perspectives. Nezami respects all prophets, including Jesus. Dante portrays Muhammad and Ali as sinners in hell, but that's not for them a big difference. That the commonality that they are both interested in religion suffices to point out to their similarities. And that's exactly my point, that Nezami is not really interested in religion per se at all. And the way I have done this is through the construction of what I called Nezamian pictorial allegory. So Nezami, Ganjavi, and Dante sure share unique creative imaginations and eloquence. Even though they lived in different and diverse cultural settings, their literary works have a few thematic similarities, including their interest in religious symbolism and love poetry. They also share the ability to produce captivating images and tales. For example, Dante's enduring literary portrayals of the angelic and demonic characters in the Divine Comedy shares some of the fictional and fantastical qualities of Nezami's stories in his Seven Beauties, Haft Beikar. Moreover, in terms of form, they both make use of heavy allegory in their constructions of their literary works. Beyond these surface similarities, their work, and that's my point, are profoundly different in their literary messages and allegorical meanings and form. Dante provides a devoted portrayal of Beatrice and his love for her, while Nezami writes sweet poems praising his female characters like Shirin and Layli. In my previous analysis of Nezami's love poetry, I demonstrated that despite various forms of love, carnal and spiritual, divine and profane, fruitful and unfulfilled, lyrical and lustful, based on attraction or obsession, fleeting passions or lasting infatuation, as seen in Haft Beikar and his other romances. Interpreting Nezami's work solely as a Sufi expressions of divine love neglects the breadth of his explorations of human emotions and his creative imagination. For Dante, love personified in purgatory and hell ultimately represents a divine concept linked to God, embodied in Beatrice. Virgil in Dante's work clarifies that the key principles of love are women to love and how much with love for God being unmistakable, as this two lines portrays. The most vital areas of comparison between their literary endeavors is their ability to construct colorful allegories. Both Dante and Nezami use natural and supernatural motifs in their portrayal of their allegorical constructs. For example, Dante fantasizes a forest where he is lost, the place where he encounters Beatrice, and where Beatrice summons Virgil. In his use of natural and supernatural elements, Nezami often illustrates Persian gardens, prairies and mountains, as well as the imagined connections of the stars with human life. Dante travels through the 9 layers of hell. Nezami takes the readers through 9 levels of the skies. Dante comes out of the valley of disappointment to convey the hopeful message of salvation through Catholicism. Nezami takes characters through tragedies to convey the redeeming quality of reason. However, Dante's Divine Comedy is a vast allegory that offers commentary on religious, politics, and love, differing fundamentally from Nezamian allegories. I conceptualize Nezamian pictorial allegory as a short, structured, interconnected passage with a surface story using scientific, religious, and natural descriptions to introduce a deeper narrative focus on his characters or events. Let us take a closer look at the story of Mahan from Haft Peker, 7 Beauties. On Wednesday of Mercury, Bahram Gur, a Sasanian king, goes to Turquoise Castle and asks Princess Azargun of Maghreb to tell him a sensual story. Dressed in turquoise, she tells the story of Mahan, which contemporary readers might or might not find to be sensual. You'll be the judge. The story follows young Mahan, who, after a strange and supernatural journey involves treasure hunting, demons, and witches, returns home to find his friends in mourning. Scholars who believe Nezami was a Sufi should in fact invest time in Mahan's story because it lends itself to such reading better than his other stories that have been used in that collection of articles. Yet, even if Nezami is meant for the story of Mahan to represent a Sufi philosophy, I would still argue that the message is not strong and that such a quality is only part of a creative process. Let us look at Mahan's adventure to see how they can be perceived as episodes of the degree of kherad, or reason. That's my translation for the word. And not necessarily Sufi stages. Episode 1. One summer night, Mahan Hushyar, his last name, a young man, attends a party in a noble's garden. After a few hours of wine and delicious food and other pleasures, he decides to take a walk. مغز ماهان چو گرم شد ز شراب تابش ماه دید و گردش آب گرد آن باغ گشت چون مستان تا رسید از چمن به نخلستان. Half drunk and happy, Mahan encounters his friends and business partner, Hayel, who offers him a share of his newfound treasure if Mahan follows him. Although Mahan feels he is straying off track, he continues to trust his friend, his sense of time and place growing increasingly unclear. While a Sufi interpretation might highlight the ill effects of greed here, Nezami often glamorizes wealth. A more likely reading found through Nezami's work is the theme of misjudgment versus reason and rationalism. Again, kharat, a concept rooted in the pre-Islamic Zoroastrian era. Mahan's excessive drinking impairs his judgment. End of the story. Episode 2. As following his friend, Mohan begins to doubt his own perception. The next day, he finds himself tired, dehydrated, and with the so-called friend nowhere in sight. He rests at the entrance of a cave. In his languor, he encounters a couple who tell him that the man who seemed to be his friend was actually Hayel, one of the deceptive ghouls and thieves of the desert. Ghouls and thieves, used interchangeably, are demonic creatures that can take human form to destroy them, to destroy people. Wicked spirits have a long history in the Zoroastrian struggle against evil forces. The Zoroastrian book of Vendida, written in the Avestan language, is a legal text containing laws against thieves. In the latter part of the mythical stories of the Shahnameh, the Book of Kings by Ferdowsi, thieves and demons represent human wickedness, a common theme in various traditions. However, Mohan's lack of good judgment is profound, as he also misjudges the couple who eventually turn out to be thieves as well. Episode 3. Mohan finds himself alone in a desert at the next dawn. He gets out and walks until evening, when he sees a horseman who also hears from Mohan his strange experiences and miseries. The horseman says the couple was Hayla and Gela, the thieves of evil doings. Still, you're lucky because they run away at dawn with the song of roosters. Again, the rooster is perhaps a reference to Surush, the Zoroastrian angel who appears in this story later on as Khizr, this mysterious character at the end, or I believe as Mohan's subconscious. I'll explain. The horseman offers his second horse to Mohan, who fails to ask himself why a rider in the middle of nowhere is giving him a horse. Once more, he misjudges a man and the situation. Episode 4. After crossing a mountain, he reaches a flat field and becomes delirious. He finds himself in a terrifying desert filled with eerie noises and shadowy creatures resembling horn-trunked hybrids of cows and elephants. Realizing his horse is disguised a seven-headed winged dragon from hell, he battles it in fear through day and night. The poet's language prompts the readers to wonder. Was this a delirious hallucination or a part of a drunken dream since leaving the garden party? Episode 5. The following day, Mohan finds himself past the desert, but rubbing his eyes, he sees another stretch of desert, hot as hell, and blood-clotted, terrifying, and seemingly with poisonous air. His response is to run like smoke, dude, all day, so at night he gets out of that hell. Episode 6. Mohan continues on his way until he arrives at a vast, deep shaft, as well as a well system where he takes a nap. Nezami does not mention purgatory or barzakh anywhere. However, This place in the well functions or can function as a place between the hellish demon-infested desert and Paradis or paradise on the other side. Mohan carves his way out of the well into a fruit garden with tall, productive, voluptuous trees of pistachio, apples, pomegranates, peaches, banana, dates, pear, juju fruits, fig, almond, oranges, grapes, and honeydew. And there are gardens in Iran that can bring all those different fruits together, fruit trees together. And he begins to indulge, and as he begins to indulge, an older man shows up and scolds him for taking the fruits. However, he forgives Mohan after hearing his story and explanations. Here, Nezami inserts his usual dichotomized construct, which includes the rare hell and paradise duality. تا که انگور کجناد کلاه دیده در حکم خود سپید و سیاه زاب انگور و نار آتشگون همچو انگور بسته محضر خون میوه بر میوه سیب و سنجد و تار چون تبرخون ولی تبرزد بار چون که ماهان چنان بهشتی یافت دل ز دوزخ سرای دوشین تافت. تیرگی را then he follows with another set of dichotomies to indicate a possible shift. تیرگی را ز روشنی است کلید در سیاهی سپید شاید دید. This line refers to the previous shift in his unwanted journey when a hole and a ray of light gives him hope at the bottom of the well, encouraging him to dig through the rocks to get to the garden. Another magical moment. The wealthy man offers to adopt him as his son, share his wealth, and find him a beautiful bride. He then takes Mohan to a place by a sandal tree in a paradise-like garden. He instructs him to climb a leather ladder to stay there the entire night and not come down under any circumstance. This is Mohan's chance to reflect on events so far. But will he, if he is tested? In a myth, we don't focus on logic and rationality. Instead, we turn inward for answers. I don't know what your answer is to that question. Yet Nezami insists on thinking, perhaps allowing King Bahram of the framed story to reflect. Enjoying the lofty comfort of the seat and the delight of the food, Mohan begins to relax in the amber ambience of the moon. The night arrives and Mohan sees 17 beautiful princes picnicking, partying, drinking wine, playing music, and singing seductive songs down below the tree. As if this is not enough to seduce Mohan, a gentle wind blows and reveals the citron-like breasts of those elegant, enthralling, enticing girls from under their white linen garments. By the way, these are Nezami's words, not mine. The princess eventually invites Mohan to join. And you guessed it, Mohan does not hesitate. He joins them and makes love to one of them who seems to be leading the group. The natural metaphor depicting the garden, sandal tree, various fruits, and wine reappear in this section to introduce the central sense of lovemaking. Terms like joss stick, source of pure wine, ruby seal, agate, and carnelian symbolize the lover's sex organs and intercourse. While this may have teased King Bahram's desire for an erotic tale, the story takes another turn. To his chagrin, the scene ends abruptly when Mahan realizes he has been deceived. The beautiful girl is actually a witch, reminiscent of the siren in Dante's tale. Mahan stops and she rebukes him, questioning why he desired her only in her attractive form. Here, however, there is no condemnation of sexual desire. The enigma lies in the subjects of that desire. Nezami vividly portrays beautiful princes and their entourage elsewhere, describing lips, necks, bodies, breasts, sexual organs. These portrayals, which became central to Romance writing after Nezami, were often associated with monarchs and royal courts inspired by ancient history. Once again, Mahan's judgment fails. He overlooks the gardener's conditions, forgetting why he is at the top of the tree. As you can see, this would be a great example for Sufi interpretation or for the purpose of comparison between divine comedy. However, given Nezami's overall work, he has used this mythical archetype to illustrate the dire consequences of failing to recognize the patterns of irrational behavior in demons, ghouls, and ignorant people. In the morning, Mahan opens his eyes to find himself in another nightmarish place, a hell filled with corpses, rotten bones, strange creatures, and filth. The paradise of the previous night has vanished. Episode 7. Mahan has no more excuses. So he produces a primal scream, a scream you hear when, quote, women give birth to a child, unquote. And he moves away as far as he can until he arrives at the sight of a clear water source. He now questions his perception. He washes up, repents, and asks God for forgiveness. The mythical, immortal, green-clothed Khizr appears to him to take his hand. Khizr tells him that because of your good intentions, I will help you go home. However, this prophetic Khizr does not give Mahan any specific advice or guidance. Mahan only vows to avoid vice and wrongdoing, echoing a Zoroastrian principle. Upon that pledge, he suddenly finds himself in his town where his friends are sitting and are dressed in azure. He too dresses in azure, and he launches into tales of his adventure. The remaining verses are about the color blue, as in the shades of azure blue and turquoise blue, to find the story's way back into the pavilion with the king, King Bahram, who, having heard the story, is excited and sleeps with Azargun, the marigold. A myth often has an ideological quality. Still, this reading shows that Nezami has manipulated whatever the original Alexandrian or story or not had been to shed light on a recruiting message. According to him, there is nothing wrong with wealth, talking to a couple, accepting a horse, and sex. However, these are among the fertile areas in which one's reasons can be tested. The story might be seen as an allegory, starting with the descriptions of the color and stars to set the mood for fantasy. However, each one of the above episodes, and indeed many of the stanzas, also have the characteristics of a pictorial allegory. In these allegories, the first story uses colors, sound, and descriptions of land before describing the details of the events or the conditions of a character. The episode in Paradise Fruit Garden begins with the descriptions of a list of fruits. However, the descriptions foretell the next event, which involves the deceptively beautiful woman, wine, and sex. Hulu or peach connotes the cheek of a beautiful woman or a lover's kiss. Juju fruits refers to the color of lips of a mistress. Shemshad or boxwood always indicates the tall, elegant figure of a beloved. Pistachio refers to woman's or sex organ, and anar, pomegranate, in Nezami's poetry always is rarely anything but the woman's breast. The words obe angur, grape juice, always means wine. Perhaps writing about such an assortment in a voluminous description to a king, is desirable to a king. Still, the lines containing them are part of the pictures, which includes the spicy party with the 17 lithe girls. The trials and the trails and travail in the story of Mahan are about the difficulty of overcoming the common human flaws, the most consequential of which is naivete. Khizr, in the end, might be a Nezamian metaphor for self-awareness, which sees necessarily for the achievement, finally, of a good judgment and reason. This point has been discussed by Patrick Frank in a good article about another story of Nezami. I'm going to skip that. So, but because Frank offers, briefly, a perceptive interpretation of this scene as well. He writes, in this self-presentation, Khizr links his apparition with the mental change of the hero. He has come in his usual function as helper for those in distress, but also as the personification of a hero's good intention. I should add that in this story, Khizr is also remotely linked to the Zoroastrian figure Surush, an angelic being known for banishing demons and appearing in various forms in Persian mythology. That is why he appears to Mahan out of nowhere and like an apparition that somewhat resembles Mahan, indicating a transformative moment in which Mahan realizes a level of self-consciousness. Thus, his last name being Hushyar, the observant. Each of the 7 stories told by the 7 princes to Bahram in Half Peker targets a flaw in the king and tries to correct him. As such, Nezami has naturally been inspired by Zoroastrian and pre-Islamic concepts, just like Ferdowsi was in his Book of Kings. In fact, Mahan is reminiscence of a name in the Book of Zoroastrian Judicial and Moral Codes entitled Book of 1,000 Judgments. That book, or the knowledge of it, as well as the book of the spirits of reason as a heavenly wisdom, could have been the sources of inspirations for Nezami. Given the possibility, we might notice that the key concept aimed at flawed humanity is common in all 7 episodes is misperception and misjudgment. Given these qualities or possibilities, it is not reasonable to read the story as the descriptions of a disciple going through 7 stages of Sufism. Beyond this contrast, both Dante and Nezami incorporate imagery of hell and paradise in their allegorical work, although Dante does so more elaborately. We could still ask if they had access to similar sources. For instance, were both authors familiar with the Sasanian text Book of Righteous Viraz, written in Middle Persian Pahlavi and later available in Arabic and Persian translation? This text narrates the dream journey of a pious Zoroastrian into an ether world sent to verify Zoroastrian beliefs about the invisible world and the efficacy of Zoroastrian rituals. The narrative, likely finalized during the early Islamic period, shares similarities with Divine Comedy. Both depict hell, purgatory, paradise, and a woman symbolizing faith, and an ascension episode. Either way, this contrast can help us view Nezami's work beyond their religious references, focusing on aesthetics of his poetry. In the story Mahan, Nezami creates a vivid allegories. As the sun travels east to west, Mahan moves across the feast site, admired like a poem, like a prom king. After a lavish meal and red wine at dawn, the mood shifts. The Nile and its banks darken, silver under twilight. The twilight gradually diminishes the vibrancy, songs, and laughter, creating a divide between Mahan and his admirers. Moreover, the similarity to Dante's work, Nezami portrayal of love is often comprehensive, diverse, and often carnal. In terms of piety and advocacy too, while Dante focuses on religion and social issues, Nezami's message is more about reason and rationality. This chart, next chart, summarizes their differences and forms resulting in their distinct allegories. This can take hours just to explain that one, but that gives you the core of my point in terms of both forms and themes. Sufi discourses and contemporary fundamentalist religiosities emphasize the necessity of divine intervention or guidance by a divine or sacred figure. In contrast, Nezami's poetry stands apart with its diverse themes, vivid allegories, and distinct style, avoiding both homoerotic tales and allegorical depictions of love for young men typical of Sufi poetry. In conclusion, Dante changed the Italian literary language and helped to shape people's imagination of hell and paradise. He helped the Bible. Nezami helped the genre by influencing the Persianate world's poetry. He used religion as a reference to help his many pictorial allegories. Thus, the purpose of this comparison is not merely to to highlight the differences between these two significant poets. Like other comparative analysis in my work, it aims to show that Nezami was focused on constructing what I just called Nezamian pictorial allegories. That is it, rather than promoting religion. By examining the concept of kherad, or reason, in his works, we might even reconsider the modern notion that the medieval mind believed human reason alone could not lead to salvation. And one more. Okay, thank you. For future research and the continuation of my work on this project, to fully understand the vast difference between Dante and Nezami, I suggest to studying not only Dante's work and all its components, but also some of his contemporary, maybe in Italy or in Florence, more particularly because they're more closer to each other, and to some of the poets who were Dante's contemporary era, and perhaps one before who would be Nezami, because they were centuries apart, and then perhaps one after. And these are the pattern or the structure of these further inquiries that I propose. You know, looking at love, looking at symbolism, looking the abstract notion of love versus carnal notion of love, divine versus earthly love again, misspelled, desire, language, and form, and morality and ethics. Now, these are my primary findings in that regard. You know, that Dante and his contemporary in Italy have these issues in common, these themes, these notions, and these conceptualizations in common. And then, on the other hand, Persian poets, including Nezami, Nasir Khosrow, Saadi, Hafiz, and we can even include Khayyam, a little bit earlier poet, and we actually have these in common. And then you see that even in the broader pictures, there is no comparison between the two. But it's a burgeoning line of research. People particularly in Italy, in the Republic of Azerbaijan, and in Iran, are writing on these things. You know, I'm not saying that these are futile. There's a lot to learn. I've learned a lot from that collection. But at the same time, we have to realize their differences. That's my point. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Talattof. We have time for some questions. Yes.
Professor Talattof, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to listen to you and learning about this quite important topic for all of us, I guess. Two questions. One is that, do you think the differences between the two giants of say, literature is because of the socio-cultural, say, milieu or context that they are growing, and they're basically, contextualizing their thoughts? And the second is that, do you see, because at the end of the day, Mahan gets that kind of awareness, and then, in Nizami, Iskandarnama, you can see there is a concept of Padishahi Hakim, or Neoplatonic king. So do you see the two also, in a way getting from the pool of Neoplatonism, to describe this awareness? Because you talked a lot about reason, kharat here and then aql here. So is this aql, or, say, kharat, if you want to say it, is it Aristotelian or Neoplatonic in a way, or very much Zoroastrian? Thank you.
Yeah, very good. Yes, I mean, the social, political, cultural, historical context of the two poets are significantly different. You know, what was going on in Florence influenced and promoted Dante to write this. He wasn't happy with the politics. He wasn't happy with the things they were going. Nezami was absolutely happy. You know, he wasn't a court poet like many other poets, but every time he wrote, at the end of his poem, at the end of the book, he bargains for money. No exceptions. He is, in one of the chapters, I called him, his work is like a sublime métier. He's a poet, an ambitious poet as well. He actually compares his work to the book of Muslims' holy book. You know, he says it's on par with those things. You know, you know, sometimes he says that I want more than what you're thinking that you're gonna give me. You know, so you see the purpose, the condition. I mean, the John Shah, the John Shahiyan, that dynasty that was ruling that part of Persia at the time. You know, that became what is now the contemporary Azerbaijani provinces. You know, Armenia, part of the Republic of Azerbaijan. You know, they were what once the Ghaznavids were, but the Ghaznavid, where Ferdowsi wrote, actually they were more inclined to uphold Islam and Islamic rules, and that is why Ferdowsi really didn't get anything. You know, they really didn't care about Ferdowsi that much. And there's a lot of anecdotes that eventually he got paid, but the payment came on a donkey at the time that people were taking his body to go bury him. You know, so they moved there. You know, later on that center, of course, moved to Herat with a different literary agenda. You know, that's when Sufism flourished, you know, in Herat area. Jami is product of that. Okay, so as you can see, the context of these poets are very different, not only between Dante and Nezami, but also Nezami and other Persian poets at the time. You know, I've compared Nezami to Ferdowsi in terms of their rewriting some of the Persian myth, or semi-historical stories like the Khosrow and Shirin, and then Nezami is different. You know, the reason. One of the reasons also Nezami is different is that because of the genre in which he's writing. Look, Ferdowsi is writing epic. In epic, for example, and I just give an example, a woman exists and glorified in terms of beauty, being brave, being a fighter, going to the war against the enemy, to extent that, sometimes even contemporary poets cannot describe so beautifully a woman hero. However, that beautiful, brave, major character disappears once she gives birth to the hero, to the champion, and the champion is grown up. Myth doesn't need that anymore, at that point. Whereas Nezami lives to the end of his romances with his female characters. It's the genre. One is epic, one is romance writing. And it's not really correct to just use religion, Sufism, Islam, in order to read these against each other. Genre is more important. Thank you.
When you mentioned various things about certain kinds of spirits, it reminded me that thinking about the way those spirits are dealt with in languages and cultures that are typically called indigenous is different than the way they are treated in cultures that have adopted certain kinds of monotheism. In monotheistic cultures, these kinds of ideas represented in part by spirits turn into allegories about human morality and behavior, as opposed to the way they are dealt with in indigenous languages as ways of dealing directly with the way the world is. So that a lot of the kinds of things that you see beginning in these eras of poetry, I think, are adaptations of metaphorical language to the forces of monotheism. And there are intermediate stages that you can see that are sort of indicative of in-between status, like early Icelandic poetry.
Well, thank you for that point. Yeah. And also, what I learned from that good comment is that, of course, Iran has never been a monolithic, religions either. So many different people, languages, religions have coexisted, particularly at that time of Nezami, in that corner of what was once Persia. It's a cultural crossroads, and all these people lived here. That is why Nezami never ever insults anyone. The other poets do sometimes, an enemy or a rival or another religion. At his time, Khaqani writes against all other religions. But he's right. He's very conscious of this diversity. Exactly, and his characters also represent that.
If I can ask one question as well, do we see alternating interpretations of Nezami's work depending on the political context in Iran and political projects by Iranian modernists or intellectuals, for instance, during the 19th century and 20th century of how they interpret Nezami?
And 21st century.
And 21st century. We forget about 21st.
Sharmin, you want to answer that question? Sharmin, by the way, is from Roshan graduate interdisciplinary program in Persian and Iranian studies in Arizona. It's a pleasure to see him here. He's working long distance now at ABD. Now, okay, so the reason one of the reasons I became interested in Nezami was that when I first started reading Nezami's works with my professor at the University of Michigan, Professor Adam Luther. And then, of course, we had to also read articles, see what other people say about this thing, interpret this, without exception. And that was, of course, in late 90s, before coming to Princeton. Without exceptions, Nezami was referred to as a pious man, a believer, a true Muslim, and even an Ayatollah. I'm sorry, not Ayatollah, even a Rouhani, a clergyman. Okay? And then I'm reading this thing, and I said, how did they come to this conclusion that he was a promoter of a faith? So that was the origin. There was one exception, Dr. Moin, who wrote a book about the representation of numbers, and that was, of course, in the 40s. Really, and this is when that falls into your area of expertise. The way they thought at the time, it was this connection of the ancient world with contemporary modern aspirations. And so numbers were important in Zoroastrianism, and therefore must have had importance in Nezami's work. That the book is all about that. But then the rest of them, Now, with the rise of the Islamic fundamentalism and then, and becoming a state ideology after the 1979 revolution, actually that was the desired approach to not only Nezami, to anyone, to any poets, Hafiz. All of a sudden, the wine in Hafiz poetry became the paradise wine. It's spiritual or allegorical, metaphorical wine. And then one after another, the students go to universities, get a degree, write dissertation or thesis on finding the connection between their holy pope and the Persian poetry. As I know, it's like, of course there are connections because a lot of these poets are Muslim. I mean, you cannot deny that. And of course, what is the main source of references in classical English literature or French literature? Of course, Bible stands out, right? So it's natural that they, make references to their holy work or to their religious stories as well. But that doesn't mean anything. Doesn't mean that these are promoting these things. So how many times you want to make this connection and then, of course, exaggerate? So that is the trend after the 1979 revolution. Nowadays, they can get away with not writing from a religious point of view and by doing comparative studies. Finding someone in Western world, either Italian or French, and then compare their work. I love this. I love reading these things. I learn from them as well. I'm not arguing that they don't contribute. But keeping the facts, the realities of the time, who, where, and when Nezami lived or Hafiz lived. Hafiz poetry has layers of meanings because he is also ultimately talking to the power, and who holds the power? It's not really the weak king of the time, it's the strong clergy of the time, and he's constantly debating with that, so you cannot just change the reality, the facts, and even change the meaning of symbolism and metaphors in his work.
Thank you so much, Professor Talattof.